So today and over the next couple of weeks, we are talking about something that we've never talked about at length, never focused on topically on this show before. We are talking about Christians and money. And the main thing that we're going to be looking at, focusing on, is should Christians be tithing 10% of everything they make, or is there a better way of doing this, of being charitable, of giving, of handling money?
Absolutely. But before we move on, you are listening to the That You May Know Him podcast, illuminating biblical truth, applying it to faith, life, and culture. I'm Jesse Dunn, joined by my co-host, Blake Barbera. First of all, before we get any further into this episode, I just wanted to thank one of our special listeners for sending me this awesome That You May Know Him coffee mug. Some delicious coffee with it to bless me on my birthday. That was very thoughtful. So thank you so much.
That's sweet. Jesse,
yeah.
You had a birthday this month, and we haven't actually been on together in like close to a month because
it's good to be back. It's been a little while.
It's good to be back. So happy birthday. Good to be back. Good to be back in the regular flow of things.
Absolutely.
Jesse, before we jump into Christians and money, tithing in particular, today we're going to look at mainly what the Old Testament has to teach us about tithing. I want to ask you this question. In your opinion, what is the most misunderstood thing for Christians, generally speaking, when it comes to tithing?
I think the most misunderstood thing about that Christians misunderstand about tithing is what their relationship with tithing should look like now that we are a part of the new covenant. And I think that most Christians tend to get their ideas from, unfortunately, what is taught throughout most churches in the United States, and dare I say worldwide, but many churches throughout the world continue to preach and teach the practice of tithing rather than what the New Testament teaches on as cheerful giving. And there is a difference. And we still, as Christians today, often hold to this idea that we are to give 10% of everything we make. And, you know, it is sort of a hard and fast rule that you give that 10% to your local church. And that is what you're supposed to do. It's almost an obligation, and most churches wouldn't go so far as to say it's an obligation, but I've rarely heard it taught in a way that doesn't compel people to give at least 10%. Now, let me qualify this and say that the New Testament model of giving shouldn't bring Christians to be less generous. It actually should prompt us to be more generous with our finances. So as we're going through this episode, we're going to look at tithing today in the New Testament, its origins that take place in the law.
Old Testament. We're looking at the Old Testament.
Oh, did I say new? I'm sorry. We're going to, excuse me, folks. We're going to look at the Old Testament, and we're going to take a look at its origins from when it first happened to when it was instituted in the law, and what the Bible has to say about it. And we're going to kind of get a better sense of what tithing was. And then next week, we're going to cover a little bit more about what does giving look like now that the law has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Does that sound like a good plan?
That sounds like a good plan. Yeah. So today, origins, I think there's a lot of misconstrued things about what tithing in the Old Testament actually was. People have this idea that tithing is like a flat 10% thing that the people of Israel had to do. it's not just that. There's different types of tithes. There's different times of giving throughout the year in the law I'm talking about. And then next week, we'll basically be asking the question, considering the New Testament, how does it apply to us? And I think it's important to say, for anybody that's like maybe already starting to tune us out, you did not say that Christians should not give at least 10%. You were talking about, you kind of hinted that maybe Christians are called to be even more charitable than we would be if we were just going by a hard and fast rule. But we'll save that for next week, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So, Jesse, the first time we see tithing in the Old Testament in the context of how we think about tithing, like someone taking a tenth of what they have and giving it to a priest. Where do we see that? What's the first instance we see something like that in the Old Testament?
Well, the first time it actually talks about that and uses the word tithe or a tenth, which, maybe you could better say the Hebrew word that I could, because you're a little more up to speed on how to pronounce a lot of that type of stuff. But
yeah, sure.
The Hebrew word for tithe literally means tenth. That is exactly what the word means, and that's exactly how the Jewish people would have understood it in that time. So
right,
it talks about in Genesis 14 that Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek,
right,
and he gives a tenth of all the plunder of war as a tribute to God for his victory in battle.
right.
That is the first time we see actually that word tithe being used. An interesting thing about that, though, there was no law in place at that time to compel Abraham to do so.
Right.
He actually did so out of his own free will volition. He was not compelled to do that in any way. But
right.
that wasn't I say that's the first, and I brought that up as the first example of when somebody tithe, but that wasn't actually the first concept of necessarily giving an offering to the Lord, right? What was that, Blake?
Right. Yeah. So that's the first place we see a tithe. And Melchizedek's very interesting character. We should probably do, an episode or a series on him at some point, because Abraham is really the first priestly type of figure we get to know post flood, right? But then there's this guy Melchizedek who comes from Salem and helps him save his nephew. And this priestly character, Abraham, honors Melchizedek as both a king and a priest, which is why he tithes to him. He's a priest, but he's the king of Salem. And like what seems like totally, random in the New Testament, this mysterious, mysterious sort of vague figure, Melchizedek from Genesis 14, is picked up by one of the New Testament writers. And basically he says, this guy was the type of Christ. He is the king and priest who has no lineage. He's the one that Abraham made offerings to. But before that, we see all sorts of occasions where offerings are made to God by people. First place we see this is Genesis 4, where Cain and Abel story takes place. And the main thing we take from this story, right at the beginning of the Bible, basically right after the fall of man, is one brother brings his best offerings to God and another brother doesn't bring his best. And so right away we learn that there are times when God accepts offerings from people when they bring their best. And there are other times, if you don't bring your best, when God doesn't accept the offering that you bring. And so that's pretty important, I would say. And you see this throughout, right? Leading up to the Genesis story with Abraham and Melchizedek. What did Noah do after he got off the ark? He built an altar and he gave offerings to God. He made sacrifices. And that sacrificial system, which is connected to tithing, carries all through the Old Testament. Ironically, Hebrews tells us that sacrificial system is gone now because we have a new high priest who offered up himself. There's been a single sacrifice made, but we still are called to give and give richly.
So
our stuff. Yeah.
So Blake, you mentioned that the word offering several times in what you were just saying about Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
And I think before we go any further, that's actually an important distinction to make, because we see them make an offering to the
Yeah.
Lord. And then when we see tithing coming up later on, the
Yep.
Bible actually makes a distinction between tithes and offerings. So we're going to get into tithes here. And
Right.
tithes were part of the Jewish law.
Yep.
That was a mandatory practice for the people of Israel to keep and uphold. Offerings were something that the people could offer of their own free will, of their own volition. They could offer up offerings to the Lord, and they were not under any compulsion to do so. That's actually how things like funding for the temple
Yep.
happened. The building of synagogues, those things were done by free will offerings.
Right.
But let's get into tithing.
Okay. Good. So what those things were done by tithing or by offerings. What was tithing for, and what types of tithing were there? Because Jesse, a lot of people, you mentioned the Hebrew word aser is how you pronounce it. It means a tithe. It's translated in ESV, I think NIV as tithe, but it literally means a tenth. So if someone says, where does the idea of a tenth come from? It comes from the fact that the word tithe in Hebrew means tenth.
And a lot of people actually have a misconception about this, because many of us today, when we are tithing, or when we are giving based on the idea that, well, in the Old Testament, they gave 10% of everything they had. So that's what we're going to give, or that's our baseline, maybe. But in actuality, there were several tithes that were part of the law. There was not just one tithe, there were several.
Exactly.
So let's get into that. Our passage is Deuteronomy 14, starting in verse 22. Blake, were you gonna go over this and read this before we
let's read
dive into the different types of tithes that are
let's read it for those who are listening. It's on the screen if you're watching us. This is going to be the main passage that we're going to work off of, but we'll be hitting other Old Testament passages as well. This is sort of the baseline for the different types of tithes that you find in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 14, 22 through 29 says, you shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year, and before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. And if the way is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe when the Lord your God blesses you, because the place is too far from you, which the Lord your God chooses to set his name there, then you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand and go to the place that the Lord your God chooses and spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves. And you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. And you shall not neglect the Levite who is within your towns, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner The fatherless and the widow who are within your towns shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. So, Jesse, there's actually, whether people caught it or not, 3 types of tithes in this passage. What's the first one that we see?
The first one is what, there is no official name ascribed to it in the Bible, as you read here, but more or less we can call it the festival tithe.
Yeah.
And it says that, every year that the Israelites were to bring their tithes to be set aside and eaten at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths.
Yep.
These were 3 feasts that they would bring their food to, and they were actually able to eat, drink, enjoy, partake in what they were bringing amongst what the other Israelites were bringing. Essentially, this is sort of the ancient version of a potluck. It really is. Maybe this is where we get the tradition today, but when we come together, we come together as a body and we celebrate and we contribute, and we enjoy not only what we bring, but what other people bring as well. And so this was to be brought to celebrate the goodness of the Lord, what the Lord has done. And what I also find a little bit interesting about this as well is that God even makes provision here for those that can't necessarily even make it to the festivals to partake in this with other people. He says, celebrate with your families at home. Go celebrate with your families. Go and buy whatever you want. Go and buy wine, food,
meat,
eat it, and do so, and rejoice before me with you and your household.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty neat. That's pretty awesome.
It is pretty neat, dude, because like the main passage we're diving into that talks about tithing, if people actually take the time to read it, it conveys something much different than what we think. People think the tithe was designed so that, as you mentioned earlier, the temple was built off of offerings, not off of tithes. People think the tithe was designed so that the Israelites could build a big building and pay for a priestly class. We're not even at the point. God doesn't even mention the city Jerusalem. Jerusalem isn't even around at this point. It's probably still going by a different name here. And it says the place where God will choose, the place where the people are going to gather together to celebrate these feasts 3 times a year. What do? You store up, you save up your tithes, and you bring them. What's the main purpose? One of the main purposes, so that you can celebrate as a community. It's kind of astonishing when you're reading about tithing and what you read is, hey, by the way, that stuff that you get with your tithe, partake of it, enjoy it, celebrate together with whether you're far off with your family and local community, or if you can make it to the central location, that's better. Do that and be with the entire nation. But there's such a communal aspect to this. And this is one of the main passages about tithing, one of the main places where we glean the purpose of what the tithe was. I mean, bro, when you think of tithing, do you think of like basically making provision for your community to be together and for everybody to have what they need to just celebrate and praise God and have a good time? Because I wouldn't, when I think of tithing, I don't necessarily think of it in that way.
Right. But we should also think of our offerings and giving to the Lord as something that we can use to bless and celebrate and rejoice in the goodness of the Lord together with the body.
Right. Exactly.
Now,
exactly.
So the next piece is the Levite tithe.
Yeah.
And so this can be found not only here, it does talk about the Levite having it talks here in this section about, in verse 27, about not neglecting the Levite who's within your towns, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. And it talks about, and it says again, that we're to lay up food and the Levite can partake because he has no portion or inheritance with you. But the Levite tithe is actually primarily found in Numbers 18, 21 through 24. And are you, okay, you're taking it off the screen. Okay.
I mean, I can put it on if you want.
It's okay. No, it's okay. I'm just going to read this for our listeners.
Passage. Okay. All right.
Go back and double check us just to make sure we're not saying the wrong thing here. But Numbers 18, 21 through 24, it says, to the Levites, I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service that they do, their service in the tent of meeting, so that the people of Israel do not come near the tent of meeting, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall do the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations, and among the people of Israel they shall have no inheritance. For the tithe of the people of Israel, which they present as a contribution to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance. Therefore I have said of them that they shall have no inheritance among the people of Israel. So, Blake, maybe you could just give us a little bit of context here. Can you just give us a quick synopsis of who the Levites were?
Yeah, Levites were descended from they were the tribe of Levi, descended. Well, yeah, I think the Levites were actually descended from Aaron. I believe Aaron was the first, one of the. I mean, I know there's a difference between a priest and a Levite. There's like basically different classes. Maybe not the best word. There's different levels in the priesthood. But Levites were the priestly class in Israel. Now, remember, God called all of Israel to be a nation of priests unto him, something that is ascribed now to us in the New Testament. We are a kingdom of priests, but Levites were essentially the priests among the priests, and they were responsible for overseeing the tent of meeting, for conducting the sacrifices that would happen every year. Once the temple was built, they had a much bigger enterprise to oversee than they did when all these things took place around a tent every year. But still, nonetheless, they were responsible for being the priestly class in Jerusalem. And the way it was set up was that all the tribes received an inheritance of land from God when the Israelites entered the promised land. But the Levites didn't. They stayed where the tent of meeting was, and they oversaw it. And they weren't ones out doing, manual labor in the sense of, they were doing manual labor in the sense that sacrificing animals was extremely hard physical work, but their needs were met not because they were farming and growing grapes. The people were bringing their tithes to support the Levites because the Levites didn't have any land. So
they didn't have any land. They didn't build wealth.
Right.
They were to live. Right. They didn't have an inheritance. They were to live only off the offerings of the people.
Yeah, that part that you mentioned is key because, a lot of times today when people are comparing the Old Testament, or that when people are drawing from the Old Testament and trying to apply it to us, the New Testament's pretty explicit that overseers and elders in God's church are to be, supported, and people who teach, are, the Bible says all sorts of things about how the church is to take care of teachers that are probably much more explicit statements than anything you could glean from the Old Testament. But Jesse, you and I both know, we've both heard people compare pastors today to Levites, right? you should be supporting your pastor just like the Israelites supported Levites. It's not a good comparison. It's not a good comparison at all.
It's not a good comparison.
Yeah, and the reason is because if you want to be compared to a Levite, you should be willing to swear off owning anything like the Levites did. They didn't. They were directed by God not to be owning things and building wealth, as you said. So
if you're a pastor and you're comparing yourself and the way in which you're justifying taking tithes, or you're preaching tithing and you're justifying that your role is similar to that of a Levite, you should then renounce your property.
Yep.
You shouldn't be able to own property. You shouldn't be able to own your house. You shouldn't be able to contribute to a 401k and build a savings account. You shouldn't be able to have a retirement fund.
If you want to be a Levite, yeah.
If you want to be a Levite, if you want to do part of the law, then you're a debtor to do the whole law.
That's right.
As Paul says later.
That's right.
But we'll get into that in next week's episode. But yeah, I wouldn't say that's a great comparison to make. I would say that God still outlines for the provision of those overseers,
the priests,
of those overseers in the New Testament. The church. But that is not the same thing. The other thing about the Levite tithe too is that the Levites were actually also to tithe the 10th of what they received to the Aaronic priests.
Right.
So they were to tithe as well, and the Aaronic priests, in the same manner, enjoyed the same type of provision through the Levite tithe.
So
sorry, go ahead,
Jesse. I just want to throw this out there. There are a couple of examples of what a Levite should not be. There's more than a couple examples, but I'm thinking of a couple specifically. Early on in Israel's history, when they were under judges and there was no king, there was a priest named Eli who had 2 sons, and they took advantage of people as people brought their offerings to the tent of meeting. And instead of taking the fat portions and the best portions of what people would bring from their sacrificial animals and giving those to the Lord and taking an honest portion, they were taking all the fat and all the best cuts of meat and stuffing themselves with it. And God, they were doing other things than that. They were doing adulterous things. But that was the thing that God said, these people basically make me sick. And he put them to death. And he took the priesthood from the house of Eli, because even though Eli was a righteous man, he did not keep his sons from using their position to enrich themselves and fatten themselves. And so their entire family was removed and done away with. Interesting, right?
That is interesting.
God doesn't like it when people take advantage of these types of positions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will say one other thing about the Levite tithe, and then we'll move on.
Yeah.
In Deuteronomy 12:19, God says, "Take care that you do not neglect the Levite as long as you live in the land." So I found that to be an interesting passage, because it also seems to attribute whether or not you give a tithe to the Levites based on whether or not you're living in the promised land. Am I misunderstanding that here?
No, that's what it says. You got to remember, the Levites had a designated place where they lived, but they didn't own land. You can't really honor the priests if you're not in the land, because this whole system that's set up in the law is centered around being in this location and having a central place of worship, which would go from being a tent to being a temple. But that's the very thing. That's the very thing that is transformed in the New Testament. And if you want to know more about this, we're releasing a video tomorrow all about what Jesus said about a third temple. A lot of people today are talking about, is there going to be a third temple before Christ comes back? Jesus had some really strong things to say about the temple that existed in his day. And if you want to know what that has to do with the third temple, you can check out the video that's coming out tomorrow. Here's a little spoiler alert. There is no central place of worship anymore now. We are the temple. The church is the place on earth where heaven and earth meet. So Jesse, yeah, we're a nation of priests. Everyone in the body of Christ who follows Jesus is called to be a priest. There is definitely no more Levitical class in the sense that there was in the old covenant. And there couldn't be if there wasn't a central place of worship.
And I would dare to say,
yeah,
most of our listeners out here listening today, you do not live in the old promised land. I mean, we may have some folks listening from Jerusalem today. I'm not sure, but
we have had listeners from that part of the world before. Yes,
maybe we do. But I would say for the majority of our audience, this is not even nearly applicable, even if the law was still to be in place, which we know that Jesus fulfilled the law. But let's move on.
But just as long as we're talking about this, Jesse, just real quick, I want to take a minute and shout out all of our listeners in Frankfurt, Germany. Yes, because for years now, we've had tons of people and downloads and people listening from Frankfurt. I've still never had anyone reach out to us, but every year it's at the very top of the list of, cities that are, most downloading our show. And I think it's time that we finally holler our listeners in Frankfurt and say, whoever you are, thank you and God bless. We salute you. Go ahead,
awesome.
Jesse.
Awesome. Who would have thought Frankfurt, Germany?
I'm thinking maybe it's like an English speaking church. I don't know. I have no idea, but maybe they'll send us an email now that we shouted them out. Go ahead, Jesse.
All right. The last one is what I would refer to as the tithe for the poor.
Yeah.
And going back to our main passage of Deuteronomy 14, and in verses 28 through 29.
Yep.
Let me pull that back up
here.
We're
going to
yep. It says, at the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your towns shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. So this tithe was actually something that you were to bring every third year. You were to bring 10% of your produce or of your animals, livestock, lay it up in the towns.
Yep.
This was something that the Levites can partake in because, again, they didn't have a portion or an inheritance in the land, but also it was welcome for the poor to be able to participate in this. The sojourner, the fatherless, and widows, they were able to come, eat, and be filled.
Yep.
So you see God working here within his people to make sure that those who were poor and needy among them were taken care of. But also, besides this tithe, God also has some other commands to Israel in taking care of the poor. What were those, Blake?
Sorry, Jesse. Say that question one more time.
Yeah, besides the tithe for the poor, God also commands Israel to do a few other things to make sure that they are taking care of those in need. What else were those few things?
He commands them to leave food behind in their fields, olive trees and vineyards that should be reserved for the poor, the sojourner, and the fatherless. So not only are they supposed to bring a third or add 10% every third year, but they're also supposed to be always cognizant of the poor among them. This is best seen probably in the book of Ruth, when Boaz instructs the people who are out reaping in his fields to leave behind, when you're reaping and you're like dropping stuff on the ground, don't be so quick to go and make sure you pick up every last thing. Leave some behind. There's this girl, Ruth, who just came back, from living abroad with Naomi, and they don't have a lot. Their husbands are dead and they need our help. So make sure that you leave some for them behind you. Don't be just like trying to grab every last kernel of what we have.
Yep. God actually instructs them not to pick up what's fallen on the ground, but he also even instructs them not to harvest the corners of the field, to leave the outer edges of the field for those, basically so they can easily access them. They can easily pick what's needed. And then when raking out like the olives from the olive tree, and he says, don't go over it a second time, right? Like you're going to get your first bit of olives down, but don't go over it and start picking off every last olive.
Right.
Leave that behind for the people who need them.
Yeah. You see this illustrated well in the book of Ruth, but you can also see just by reading this and thinking about it, how stuff like this could easily be taken and turned into these really strict laws, right? Like imagine being an Israelite 700 years after this was written, and you're going out to pick fruit off your tree, and you see this beautiful peach that you had your eye on it the night before, but now it fell to the ground, and you're like, okay. And you go to pick it up and someone's like, hey, that fell on the ground. Don't eat that. That's for the poor. It's like, none of these, I don't believe, at least this aspect, is meant to be this rigid, hard and fast rule. What God is saying here is, remember that there's poor among you, and make sure you're not trying to grab every last bite of everything that you have to keep for yourself. I'm God. I'm the one who provides for you. Make sure you're being aware of the other people who have needs. And if someone comes by and picks up a piece of fruit from underneath your tree, let him eat it. Let him eat it. I'm surely God is able to provide for you and for the entire nation. In other words, we don't need to all be a bunch of sticklers, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Tightwads. And Jesse, if we were going to add all this up, so if we add all this up, what have we got? We've got 3 times a year, the people are supposed to come and bring their tithes with them. And then they're also supposed to remember the Levites. And then also every 3rd year, another 10% for the poor, plus making sure you're leaving extra for them laying around. People think that you read the Old Testament, there's just some flat 10% tithe, sort of like a flat tax of your income every year. It was actually way more than that. It was way more than that.
And what's also interesting, though, too, and one thing we didn't mention here is that God also says that every 7th year to take a break.
Rest. Yep.
To rest.
To rest.
Take a break. And
you're supposed to store up for that too.
We're supposed to be storing up for that throughout this process.
Yep.
But we're not tithing. We're not bringing those things every 7th year because we've let our fields rest, letting it recuperate. Us as a people, we're resting. Yep. And I just want to say to any preachers, pastors that are still preaching the concept of the tithe out there, ask yourself this: if you're adhering to the tithe, are you letting your people rest from tithing to your church every 7th year? I would ask that question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Are you taking the main portion of that money and setting it aside for the communal festivities, right? The first part of this tithe seems to be, like saving for holidays. It's sort of how I can equate it to modern life. The festival tithe is like, hey, make sure you save up enough so when the time comes for the community to stop working, to rest, to gather, and to feast and celebrate, you have enough for yourself and for others. Is that what most of our tithes go to? And then the other part is, of course, honoring and taking care of the Levites, but that's not the same thing as building a massive church.
It's not.
Right? It's not.
So yeah, in the New Testament, we do see a much different model. I would just refer to it as cheerful giving. We'll dive into that next week. But before we end this episode, I don't think we can really move on from what the Old Testament has to say about tithing until we at least talk about what God says in Malachi.
Yeah.
Because it's probably the most oft quoted section of the Bible when pastors are teaching their congregations about giving. Yeah. And no doubt, I think there are still principles that apply here in the New Testament, in this modern age that we're living in. But I would say, again, still, there's a difference between tithing and cheerful giving.
Yeah. So you're talking about Malachi 3, 6 through 12 is the bigger context of the passage that people like to quote. It's the passage about, God giving a blessing, and not robbing God of what's owed to him. Jesse, but before we just give a quick context of what this passage is about, I just want to say, for our listeners, if you really take the time and study this in the Old Testament and think about it, there's sort of an underlying foundation that supports this whole idea of tithing and what the real purpose of it was. Yes, it was to have times to celebrate. Yes, it was to take care of the Levites and to take care of the poor and all those things. But when you add it all up, you kind of are left asking yourself, how am I supposed to get by on what my crop produces every year when I'm taking 10% 3 times a year? I'm setting aside 10% for the every third year festival. I'm remembering the poor. I'm not working every 7th year and I'm storing up for that. It almost leaves you with the impression of like, how is this going to work if I'm doing so much to be God focused and others focused? How am I going to have and remembering to take time to be communally focused on my community? How are we going to make it? If we're giving so much and saving so much for these tithes and these different occasions, and that is exactly the point. The point, one of the main points of all this, I believe from God's perspective, is when you align your life so that you are focused on the Lord and the things that he cares about, including making your time with your community a central aspect of your life, honoring the people in your life who are spiritually enriching and feeding you, taking care of the poor and the needy among you, the widow and the sojourner. When you align your life to care about the things that God cares about like that, when you're a person who's like, you know what, I'm not going to work like a dog. I'm going to take a week off and just totally focus on my family. I'm going to take a day every week called the Sabbath and totally focus on worship and community. When you orient your life that way, God takes care of you. That's the point. He supernaturally provides for you and enriches you in ways that you could never have imagined. And I think it's supposed to be hard on our flesh to get to the point where we are giving as much of our resources as we possibly can to show that we care about the things that God cares about, and we're not gleaning our satisfaction in life in the stuff that we possess and in the, in the security that we have. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Do you want to add anything, or do you want me to read the Malachi passage?
No, you said it well. Why don't you go ahead and read Malachi?
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. So Malachi 3, 6 through 12, this is what it says. For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore, that's going to be key when we talk next week. Therefore, you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed. From the days of your fathers, you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you say, how shall we return? Will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? In your tithes and contributions. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. I will rebuke the devourer for you, so that it will not destroy the fruits of your soil, and your vine in the field shall not fail to bear, says the Lord of hosts. Then all nations will call you blessed, for you will be a land of delight, says the Lord of hosts. And Jesse, as you said, we read this all the time, and we glean that one great thing, like we kind of hold on to that promise verse. I'll pour you out a blessing. But remember, God's rebuking Judah. He's rebuking Jacob in the beginning of this passage for not honoring him by orienting their life around him. And contextually, generally speaking, this is what's going on in Malachi. You got to know the context if you want to understand any Bible verse. Israel is going into another dark period. The people have returned from exile. This is, remember, after Isaiah, after Jeremiah, after the Babylonian exile. But things have been difficult, and they're entering a time when no prophets will be among them for several hundred years. But lots of things are going to go down. This is the last book in the Old Testament. We're entering, when this is written, the intertestamental period, where Israel would again more or less be conquered by the Greeks, scattered through Egypt, and through, then the people that are left in Judah would be, ruled by the Seleucid Empire. You'd have the Maccabean revolt. All sorts of stuff's going to go down, but no prophets. And through this whole process, God would be preparing the world for the coming of Messiah. But as I said in the book, God's rebuking Judah for profaning the covenant and simultaneously giving them a preview of the next prophetic figure that would be on the scene, who would be John the Baptist, the one that would prepare the way for the Lord. And what he says is, this is happening because you have robbed me. You've robbed me of what was due. And what was really due was not just tithes, although that's how we demonstrate how our lives are oriented in many ways. But God wanted their lives to be oriented around worshiping and loving him, and they failed to do it. And so God tells them what would happen if they did orient their lives around him, and if they did bring their tithes. You won't be robbing God. And when you don't rob God, you get blessed by God. He opens windows of heaven. But more or less, that passage is about them entering a dark period. We still glean a lot from it, because the promise still stands true. God doesn't change. When we honor him with our lives, he blesses us in unimaginable ways. But that's what the passage is really about.
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, the biblical principle still stands. It even says, sow bountifully, reap bountifully, sow sparingly, reap sparingly. In the New Testament, that is not necessarily a principle that has done away. But
amen.
For our listeners out there today, I hope this has been something that has helped you better understand the origin of tithes, what really took place with tithing in the Old Testament. I almost did it again. In the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And that, again, it was a part of the law. It was a part of the Mosaic law that the Israelites were compelled to uphold. And to all our listeners out there, now that we are no longer under the law, we are no longer debtors to the law, when we're freed from the law, what does that look like in the New Testament? What does that look like for us today? It looks like cheerful giving. We're going to get into that next week. So stay tuned. Come back and we will dive into that. What do you say, Blake? You want to?
Perfect.
Sign us
Absolutely. You've been listening to the That You May Know Him podcast, illuminating biblical truth and applying it to faith, life, and culture. If you want to learn more about our ministry, just listen to this little outro that we're about to play. Until next time, for Jesse Dunn, I'm Blake Barbera signing off. Stay blessed, live loved, and we will talk to you soon.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. Also, please consider giving us a 5-star review and telling your friends to subscribe as well. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and check out our website for tons of free, biblically based content like Bible studies, devotionals, articles, and Bible teachings. The That You May Know Him podcast is produced by That You May Know Him Ministries, Durham, North Carolina. You can visit our website at thatyoumayknowhim.com.